Rita, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
And I cannot do your incredible background justice, so I will just let you take it from here. Tell everyone about your journey and what you're doing these days.
Sure. So my day job is as a professor at Columbia Business School, where I teach at the intersection between strategy and innovation, primarily for executives. So I run a week-long course in normal times called Leading Strategic Growth and Change, which is probably quite familiar as a topic to a lot of your audience. I also write books. I travel around talking. And lately I've been, since we're all kind of locked down, I've been doing a series of Friday fireside chats, I call them, and I have an actual fireside. And the idea is to really just bring thinkers to people who might not ordinarily have the opportunity to hear from them on kind of topics that are relevant to them. So we've had Alex Osterwalder on, we've had Rebecca Henderson talking about her fabulous new book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And upcoming are a lot of very interesting people that that your audience might be interested to talk to. So I think that's something new I'm doing given COVID. The other thing I'm doing that I think is important is we're trying to develop tools that people can use to pretty rapidly assess their portfolios, kind of rethink their strategies, make some tough decisions about what we're going to be funding and what we're not. But then also think about your capabilities and new places to where your capabilities can be turned. So busy working on software for that. I'd be happy to discuss that with anybody who is facing those issues.
Great. So tell us again. You just ran through that too quickly. Take us through, your experiences, what you've done over the years, and what you're excited about these days.
Well, I'm excited about what I'm calling the great unfreezing, which is, I'm told it takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days to form a habit. And what's happened now is all of our taken for granted assumptions about our businesses, about, how we're going to get back to whatever the norm will be once this is all behind us. And I don't think it's going to go back to where it was. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's going to be a while before I'm going to be like super happy traveling through Kennedy Airport, until we sort of know where this virus is taking us. But the good news is that, in innovation, right, we've always lived in a world of what I call high assumptions relative to knowledge. And what's happened now is if you think about your portfolio of activities, things that you used to call the core business, like the operational, steady state kind of very predictable business, has now been moved into high uncertainty. And so what I think is really fascinating is the tools that those of us in the innovation community use all the time are now going to be relevant to a much larger swath of the economy. So just as an example, if I were to take Columbia Business School's MBA class, right? If you had asked me 6 months ago what the MBA class of 2019 was going to be like, I would have said it's going to be an awful lot like the MBA class of 2018. And it's going to be an awful lot like the MBA class of 2022 because the business has been running for over 100 years. And it just kind of, it's a very well-regarded brand. It's very competitive for people to get in. And so very predictable, right? Very exploit-oriented, very core business. Well, if you ask that same question today, the honest answer is we have no idea. We don't know if our students are going to be able to come back to campus. We don't know if they're going to decide this is the time to take the plunge. And you can make arguments either way, right? We do know that tough times tend to result in higher applications and admissions because the opportunity cost of going back to school is so much less. But also we know that if we can't offer a physical campus experience, that a great deal of the value of the 2-year in residence MBA is likely to be eroded. So it's a fascinating thing. And I think you're just seeing this all over the economy. Everybody's, if they're honest, their answer is we don't know. We just don't know. So what we have to do is adopt some of the tools from innovation, specifically tools around rapid learning, iteration, defining a hypothesis and conducting a small test, and then defining the next hypothesis and learning what that looks like. And I think that's going to be incredibly relevant to what we have to do next.
Right. And what about innovation in this period of crisis, clearly we're seeing a lot of innovation around the response, as far as, in different areas, whether it's healthcare companies or biotech companies or even maker spaces, ramping up to make shields.
Mhm.
Tell us how you view innovation during this pandemic.
Well, it's critical, right? I mean, we know in a high uncertainty situation, innovation is the only way you're going to get to any kind of an answer. So I think that's the first observation. I think what you will see is a turning away from what I've been calling innovation theater. So we went through a patch of 2-3 years where everybody had to have, a corporate incubator and an accelerator and a this and a that, and Post-it notes on the walls, and everybody doing boot camps and all that stuff, without it really touching the core activities of the business. And what I think you're going to see now is a much more serious, much higher on the agenda view. I mean, if your entire business model has just blown up, you have no choice but to innovate. You've got to do something new and different. And so I think while, there will be a tendency for some companies to say, oh, I just can't afford this. And I've got a few clients that are in that position. History teaches us that those that pursue innovation, those that keep their workforce and their capabilities intact, those that are prepared to invest in these recession kind of times, tend to be the ones that rocket right out of it when things begin to improve.
Well, that's really comforting to hear, because we always hear about the downside of these recessionary times.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that they have to innovate to get themselves out. And let's hope they're prescient enough to realize it. And are you seeing, at this point, what are you seeing? Are you seeing more of the former or the latter in the community?
Me personally, I'm seeing a lot more of the former, but that may be a subjective thing, because the people that are going to be interested in talking to me are probably in that former category anyway. So I'm not sure I would say that applies across the whole economy. But what I am seeing is, I'll give you some examples. So I've got one client that's a bank that whose CEO has said, our customers are, in many cases, small, medium-sized enterprises. They need help with their PPP applications. There's other services they need, but we need to be strategic about how we serve them, because we have to really understand what they're going through, and we have to really understand how to make a meaningful difference. So they've been using a lot of my customer insight tools to really understand their customer's journey and how they go through. Other folks are being really faced with digital issues. So, if they were sort of on a digital transformation track before this, now they're getting shoved into it, at highway speed. And I just have an HBR article that just came out called Discovery-Driven Digital Transformation. And the thesis in that article is, the wrong way to do this is a big, giant leap into the unknown, because digital transformation really touches everything about your business. And if you don't do it thoughtfully and carefully and embedding a lot of learning into it, it can really come back to haunt you.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of interest in those kinds of ideas. And I think also that what people like is that, you don't have to invest a good bazillion dollars in this stuff, right? There's a lot you can do with careful and risk ring-fenced budget.
Right. Well, talk to us about one or two companies that you see have innovated rather quickly in this crisis that you're impressed with.
Sure. So, a fantastic story is Dyson, the guys that make vacuum cleaners and stuff. And they've got a fascinating corporate strategy. Basically, if it sucks, blows, or runs on batteries, we're in, right? But they're kind of like the Apple of the appliance space. So they charge a big price premium, and they, market globally to all over the place. And they're known for, super high quality, very, very finely functioning products. So back in 2015, James Dyson, the CEO, conceived of this idea of Dyson going into the electric car business. And the concept was they were going to design from the ground up an electric car. And at the time that they made that decision, the only competitor really was Tesla. And the mental model they had about what the electric car was going to do was premium priced, advanced technology, get them really into that kind of battery-powered mobile sort of space. So they set up a campus in England on an old airfield and got to work. Well, fast forward 4 years to 2019, and now everybody on the bloody planet, that's in the car business is talking about manufacturing electric vehicles. Now that wouldn't be such a problem for Dyson. They're used to working in very highly competitive markets. The problem was that the big majors were going to be selling these cars at probably to price them comparable with internal combustion engine cars, and EVs are more expensive to make and to own. And they had to face the realization that this project, which they'd had such high hopes for, was not going to work out economically. That the margins they're used to getting on their products, which is 30% or so, were just not going to hold. And they made the very difficult decision of terminating the project. Okay. So that was October of 2019. Fast forward a few months, and now we've got COVID-19. And the National Health Service in England basically threw down a challenge. They said, well, can manufacturers provide us with more ventilators and with more equipment for our health service workers? And within 10 days, Dyson designed from scratch a ventilator, converted the operating activities in the now stopped car project over to the manufacturing of these devices. And they now have thousands of them that they can sell to the NHS and to other health systems that need them, just really, really rapidly. And I think that's a very interesting story of how you can take adversity, but with a lot of talent. And he didn't lay everybody off, by the way. He was really trying to redeploy the talent and the resources that they had. So I think that's a great story of how you can kind of move quickly into a new opportunity space. And that's super innovative, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And clearly, there's probably at least one or two people from England on this call. We have a global audience. But is there anyone in the States that might have done something similar or that you're impressed with?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a smaller company up in Connecticut whose main business was making really beautiful shutters and sort of outdoor veneers and stuff like that, and nobody's buying that stuff now. And what their CEO realized was that the same kind of capabilities that they could use to make the shutters could be used to make protective equipment for hospitals. So before this, he had about 60 people. Now his stuff is in such demand, he's got about 250. So he's more than doubled his staff, and they've just ramped up production like crazy to provide protective gear. The mask, the plastic masks, and those kinds of things. So that's another kind of interesting example. But there are lots of them. I mean, there's a company out in California that makes really silly stuff. They make like glow pens and lanyards and all that stuff for events, basically. But what they have that nobody else, what they have that's unique was ties to, manufacturers in China. And so what the CEO of this company's done is he said, well, nobody's buying glow pens and lanyards if they're not having events. And, if I'm on an electronic conference, I don't need a lanyard that says my name is, who I am, right? But what he offered to do was use his Chinese connections to try to source hard to get supplies. So N95 masks and so forth from a network of suppliers in China. So he's basically taken his business and stopped the resale of these items and converted into running more kind of trading operation. So there's a lot of, I think, very innovative responses that are taking place now. Some of the companies that concern me more would be, for example, Disney. Okay, nobody's going to theme parks, we understand that, but Disney basically laid off tens of thousands of people. And to me, that well, first of all, I think it's bad for their brand. And secondly, this is a company that has been doing stock buybacks and has been richly rewarding shareholders and And, you're telling me that the people, you couldn't give them some grace period. You couldn't give them some grace time. And I mean, I understand the business rationale, but I think what's going to happen once we get to the next phase of whatever this is, I think there will be organizations that people will remember how well they behaved. Oh, what's the guy that very famously is paying his people $70,000 a year? it's a payments company whose name is escaping me. But anyway, Gravity Payments. Anyway, that company basically did an all hands. They said, what do we have to do to keep everybody on staff? He took personally a pay cut. Everybody's, volunteering what they can, right? And so they are getting so much reputational benefit and so much good PR about that. And it's real, that they're getting increased interest. And, he's made the point for years now that high quality employment practices, reduce turnover, improve customer service, give people more of a sense of security. And I think one of the things I would love to see come out of this pandemic is that recognition that, we have become a nation of people where, half the people are living economically insecure lives and health insecure lives. And, there's something fundamentally not quite right about that. So one of the things I've been writing about is if you looked at history, if you looked at World War II, after World War II, what you had was the prospect of 30 million servicemen coming back from overseas and having no jobs to go to. And so an organization called the Council for Economic Development, which was a business-led organization, started meeting to talk about what business could do. And essentially they created the post-World War II social contract, which created the American middle class as we have known it. And it involved things like cooperation with labor, decent pay, a commitment to local communities. So, a commitment to avoid things like mass layoffs, because that generation of business leaders had been through the Great Depression. They saw what that had done. And they knew that if 30 million people were just thrown on the street, that it was going to lead to social unrest. I mean, there was going to be all kinds of things. And I hope we are at that kind of a pivotal moment. And the reason I hope that is, and that one of the best advocates for this is a very wealthy capitalist named Nick Hanauer. And he talks about pitchfork economics. And he said this ridiculous trickle-down economic policy is impoverishing my customers. And if you think about it, right, if people can't afford to buy whatever it is you're selling, and they're just living on bare necessity, then there's a downward cycle that starts, right? There's less demand. That in turn means people are paid less, and da. So I would love to see one of the positive things coming out of this to be a rethinking of how we share resources in our society. The other really interesting thing to me is we're now starting to become aware that, many of the people we treat the worst in an economic sense are people we absolutely depend on.
I think that's a really good point. Rita, before we talk about your great book, I want to remind people to submit some questions, but I want to ask you again, we mentioned this before about larger companies. They should be innovating now to get through this crisis. But there's a bunch of folks on this, on this chat listening in who are from corporates, and they're leading the innovation areas or departments. And I'd like to get your advice to them on how they should manage through, how they should communicate, how they should manage up as well as down, because their jobs are so important, yet it's just such a difficult time.
It's a difficult time. And one of the real challenges of the innovation jobs is that very often they're not powerful jobs. They're jobs where you get some budget and sort of a mandate to go and do something interesting, but it's not like being a COO or being another member of the C-suite. In many cases, not always. Some companies do, of course, have a much higher priority for that. I think the first thing I would advise is really think about this messaging, that in a period of high uncertainty, the tools of innovation are the appropriate tools. And I think this is something that innovation people really need to communicate. And the reason I think it's so important is many of the people that you're going to need to negotiate with politically, you can get to be very senior in any large organization and never have come within 50 feet of innovation, right? You're known for being an operator, you're known for being efficient, you're known for being whatever. So you're going to have to do a lot of training and education because their instincts are going to be wrong. And that's the part that they don't understand. So, if I've never learned that I need to have short learning sprints and get new information and test hypotheses in a really quick way, if I don't know that, then my instinct is going to be to set out some kind of monolithic plan. And it's just the wrong way to go about it. It's a wasteful way to go about it. It's a dangerous way to go about it. So I think the first big thing I would recommend is really start having that conversation around what are the appropriate disciplines to manage under high uncertainty. And a lot of those disciplines are going to come from innovation. So that's first. Second, I would really think about who the stakeholders in your situation are. So who are the people with a stake in either your success or in the future success of the organization? And I would put together a real stakeholder strategy. Like, you can be useful to those people. And let's think about how that looks. How is that going to be helpful? The third thing I guess I would do is try to really be disciplined about where you're putting your resources. So if you were working on 10 projects, maybe you need to be honing that down to 5. So getting a real handle on the portfolio of things that you're working on, I think, is super important. So those are some ideas on how you can operate. I do think it's important to remember this is a political activity. You're going to have to try to influence people who may be thinking about something else entirely, or maybe in crisis mode. And I think it's important to be respectful of that. I mean, people have emotional states, but also to really put together a sort of elevator pitch about how you could be helpful to them.
I think that's great advice. And it's always good advice to over communicate, right? But especially during crises. And to start as early as possible.
Yeah, because if people face a void, they'll fill it with whatever comes into their heads, right? And so, yeah, over communicating, key.
So tell us about your latest and greatest book.
Oh, the book. So the book, promotional opportunity, right? Seeing around corners. So the book had its seeds actually in Andy Grove's work back from the 90s. And he wrote a fabulous book called Only the Paranoid Survive, which focused on strategic inflection points. And since then, not that much work has been done on strategic inflection points. So I got really interested in, how does an inflection point sort of unroll throughout its life, right? And so the book is really about how do you see them coming? Having seen them, how do you decide what to do about them? And then how do you bring the organization with you? So let me define what a strategic inflection point is. And we're in the middle of one right now, so this won't be difficult. So a strategic inflection point is something that happens in the environment typically that causes your assumptions about your business to become less representative of reality. So I mentioned earlier about Columbia Business School. Well, we have piles of assumptions about how the business school model works that are now suddenly being challenged. And we do not know at this stage what the future business school is going to be. And so that's an example of how the assumptions that you had been making are often now invalidated. Now, that's particularly interesting because most inflection points take a long time to unfold. We experience them as having emerged suddenly. So, many people's experience of this COVID-19 crisis are that this thing came out of the blue and, oh my God, we weren't prepared. And it's a very fast thing. But if you look at the history of pandemics, right, it is predictable that something like this could happen. And people have been warning about it forever. As recently as I think it was October of 2019, there was a huge what do they call them, like a wargaming exercise done, and they had actual politicians and generals and military people and everybody involved. And the report card that came out of that was this country's woefully unprepared, and that was October. And we already were seeing evidence of something kind of not great going on in China. So my point is that if you look back, obviously Bill Gates had his very famous 2015 TED Talk. If you go back further even than that, there was a lot of people that said, we don't know what, we don't know when, but we know this needs to be taken seriously. And one of the most interesting things to me about this particular inflection point is President Bush had read a novel about the the big flu from 1918, I think it was. And this so impressed upon him the need for preparedness that he actually created at a federal level this entire system of pandemic preparedness, which subsequently got dismantled. As a friend of mine who's in public health says, the problem with being in public health is if you do the right thing and the crisis doesn't occur, there's always going to be a chunk of people who say, see, you overreacted. That wasn't necessary, right? And so anyway, the book is really about how do you navigate through, how do you kind of bring the organization with you as you are experiencing this shift in business conditions. You're on mute.
You were presenting on this, and you mentioned the wonderful metaphor about ice or snow. Can you just go over that? Because I thought it was just so lovely.
Yeah, I call it snow melts from the edges. And again, that draws inspiration from Grove, who said, if you wish to see where spring is making itself felt, you must travel to the periphery, because that's where the snow is most exposed. And the way I talk about that is snow melts from the edges. So if you want to see the signs of something changing or happening as a leader, you need to get out to what I call the edges of your organization. So, because these things don't present themselves neatly on the, corner table at the conference room, right? They bubble up when somebody says, well, that was weird. Why did that customer say that? Or, that's new. I didn't, or gee, I didn't get that order because somebody said they 3D printed something and they no longer need my parts. That's where these things start to make themselves felt. But if you think about it, most of the time, the people at the edges don't sit at the strategy table, right? The service people, the people that interact with customers, the people that do customer service calls, they don't sit at the strategy table. And so how do the things that they're seeing and the things that they're sensing make their way to where strategic decisions can actually be made? And I think it's very important for people who are designing organizations to have ways of doing that. And so in the book, I talk about 8 snow melts from the edges, and it's 8 practices that go with that. So it's things like William Gibson, the science fiction writer, very famously wrote, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet." So how often do you actually go to where the future is starting to make itself felt? So for me, I go to a lot of, we'll probably go again to, conferences about things that aren't necessarily right in my wheelhouse, and sort of, look at new technologies, talk to the entrepreneurs, see who's creating that future that eventually will be important and widespread, but it's beginning to just make itself felt now.
So I think that is a great sort of strategy. And right now, we are in sort of the golden age of access, during this pandemic, to a lot of smart people, a lot of wonderful conferences that have gone online because they can't be in real life. And either they're making it very affordable, even free. And so I think all of us should probably pick up that strategy and just set aside some time to explore, whether it's real time or an on-demand broadcast of something that's out of our wheelhouse, as you say, sort of something that we typically wouldn't go to, because our mind could be opened, see new ideas, or see things from different perspectives, and then apply them and see opportunities. I think that's a really great strategy. Okay, before we get to questions, I want to ask folks to keep submitting questions. I want to try and get as much wisdom from Rita as possible here. But before we go to questions, I want to ask Rita just to share one thing with our audience.
Share one thing. Well, I think the first, I think what I would share is that when you have this period of great unfreezing, we have choices to make about how we want to build things up. So I'd encourage people to be very mindful, and I don't mean that in the spiritual sense, I just mean mindful of the decisions you make that could have a path-dependent consequence as we come back. So be thoughtful about the choices you're making about things like structures, incentives, practices, processes, because you have a chance to change them now, and don't miss that chance.
That's really great. I think, and we can apply that to not only business but our lives in general, right? Use this pause as an opportunity to do things a little differently.
Yeah,
make a difference.
I have a wonderful entrepreneur friend who said to me on the phone, he said, don't tell anybody, but I am really enjoying this. It turns out he has a little office that's just on the other side of his yard. And so he goes to work, but he can come home and have lunch with his kids. And, he knocks off at a reasonable time of night. He's not on airplanes all the time. He's not in the middle of deal conversations, and he's having a ball. And I think for a lot of us, we're going to start asking questions about, tell me again why I'm getting on a plane and flying to Singapore for an hour and a half speech, and tell me again why I'm, so I think there's going to be a lot of rethinking about things we had basically been taking for granted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, let's get to some of these questions. Mario is asking, what are your thoughts on how large companies rely on smaller, agile, and innovative new ventures or growth ventures? How they should sort of collaborate with them or rely on them?
I think it's a great way of perhaps blending the strengths of both. It's difficult. The smaller, more agile companies and big companies tend to have a different clock speed. A company that does it really well is actually Coca-Cola. What they've been doing over the last 10 years or so is they've been partnering with and then often acquiring what are sometimes thought of as near field opportunities. So these are companies whose business model is going to be ripe in, say, 18 months. And they've been using that to kind of expand quite systematically the arenas into which Coca-Cola can go. I do think it requires being, really thoughtful about the stress you're putting on the small company. I mean, the last thing you want is 15 guys from like IBM turning up and saying, right, we're here to learn, and you're like, I've got a job to do. I've got work to do, So you need to be managing the interface carefully. But when it's managed carefully, it can be a really nice outcome for both sets of firms. So as an example, a company that I write about in the book is called Flatiron Health, founded by two guys, basically with no healthcare experience, Wharton grads. They came from the same entrepreneurship center I did at Wharton. And their first business was sold to Google for something like $94 million. And then they spent 2 years sort of under lock and key at Google. And then when they were finally released, they said, let's find our next venture. The inspiration came from the nephew of one of the co-founders who was diagnosed with leukemia. And, when they dug into it, they could find like no facts, right? No, like the information was all buried in like individual oncologists' offices, and there was no easy way to find out what the most effective treatments were or how prevalent this was. And so the dad of this nephew kind of looked at these two guys and was like, so you tell me you're tech entrepreneurs, why don't you fix this? And that idea kind of caught on, and they spent probably about a year working on the idea. And here's what the business model that emerged. They would design software that would be used in oncologists' offices. And they would give the oncologists the software basically for free in exchange for having access to anonymized data about, they started with cancer, so it really just oncologist offices. And then that data could be used for research purposes or, other things. Very thoughtful, very thoughtful. And they began to use this data in ways that were fairly novel. They were acquired by Roche, big pharma company, for $3 billion a couple of years ago. And one of the things they're innovating, just for example, because now they've got this data, right? And the FDA has actually approved some protocols for clinical trials that allow them to simulate a control group based on the patterns that they found in the database. So I think this was a clinical trial for breast cancer. And if you can simulate a control group, first of all, it cuts the cost of doing the clinical trial in half. But it also means if you think you have a treatment that's effective, you're not withholding it from a group of patients who might really benefit from it. So there's some just very cool things that they're doing. So that's an example of, startup to kind of marketplace position to eventually being acquired by a big company. And the reason they did it was they felt it could give them scale. And they also felt that with a larger partner like Roche, there's a lot more capability there that goes beyond just the information. You could actually do something with the information.
Right. So Ronnie asks, it's a longer question, but the point is, about norms in general, right? Who would have thought we would have to remove our shoes, 20 years ago, but now it's normal after 9/11, obviously. And he's saying, what norms that are primarily related to proximity and hygiene, what norms that might we have dismissed just a year ago await us 1, 3, or 5 years from now?
I think you're going to see a ton of stuff. So an obvious one is handshaking, right? We're going to have different ways that we greet each other. And if you think about how the disease has differentially affected different cultures, right? Italians, they hug each other, it's kissing on the chin, all that stuff, versus Japanese, bow formally and keep their distance. So the handshaking clearly is going to be one. I think we will see reconsideration of how people are being asked to physically show up. So, before I ask you to come into a crowded room, or before I ask you to come to a space which might be dangerous for you, I'm going to have to really, I'll have to have thought through a really good reason. So I think there's some norms there that are likely to be shifting. Really, our taken for granted assumptions about anything involving physical proximity, big sporting events and massive carnivals and big festivals and cruise ships, anything that relies on people being physical proximity, I think we're going to get big question marks. Another thing that I think is likely to have an effect on smaller businesses too is, if you look at models like the restaurant model, sort of artisanal restaurant kind of, thing, many people have reported that whole sector was actually under pretty severe financial pressure before this. So Gabrielle Hamilton, for example, who owns a small restaurant in New York, was saying when she first opened in 1999, like there was no such thing as artisanal, local, farm to table, blah, 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 blah. And since then, these things have just mushroomed all over the place. So I think you're going to start to see some contractions in those more fragile settings where they were already in trouble before this. So I think you'll start to see some contractions there. And so I think our norms around what's the kind of business you want to start are likely to be, shifting. The idea that, I want to create a cool experience for paying customers is going to be really different.
Right. Thank you for that. So Jay asks, what things should companies or people invest in when there's so much uncertainty?
Financial investment?
Yeah, as far as companies looking for, scouting, looking for areas to invest in as a way to sort of, see into the future and to innovate. Yeah,
so I think the starting point for that question for me is always, what's the customer's job to be done? You have to kind of work backward from that. And so let me explain that concept. So this was something Clayton Christensen very famously developed. Tony Ulwick also works on it. And basically what it says is, organizations don't do business with you because they want to do business with you. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, yes, today I signed my purchase. I mean, who does that? Nobody. The reason I'm doing it is there's some outcome I'm trying to drive, a job to be done. And what Clay used to say is, don't think of buying products and services, think of hiring them to get a job done in your life. And so if you're thinking of where to make investments, you should be thinking about how would this thing that I'm thinking of investing in translate into a superior way of getting a job done in somebody's life? Is that market going to be attractive enough that it's worth giving some time to? So I think you really have to start with what is it you're doing for a customer, and then work backward. So interestingly, right, I've been talking to a small community-based bank, and they had total clarity around what their small business customers needed, which was access to this PPP. And what they found was people were getting turned down by like the Chase Manhattan banks of the world. They weren't interested in the smaller customers. And this community bank basically put a sign out and was like, open for business. And they have been working 24/7 round the clock just to get the mechanics of this handled. And it's resulted in, I think he told me, 25% more good customers coming into contact with them. And so that's an example of I have real clarity about what I can do that would make a difference here, and then putting resources into that. You're on mute, Jim.
Oh, here's a question from Barry. How do you see traditional education, how how do you see that changing, particularly in regard to classrooms and proximity?
Mhm. Well, until we have some way of tamping this thing down, and Jim Kim talks about, 5 things, right? You need to be able to test, you need to be able to trace, you need to be able to isolate, you need to be able to contain, and then you need to be able to treat. And if you're missing any of those pieces, you're not going to be able to say you've conquered this thing. So that's kind of the first public service announcement I would make. Like, let's really push that, because I think until you have those things, people are going to feel very uncomfortable having their children in, small classrooms. And, let's not forget, schools are not just classrooms, right? They're hallways, they're cafeterias, they're, backpack hooks. I mean, it's almost impossible not to be in physical proximity with other kids. And kids, are always doing physical things. And the younger they are, the more that happens, right? So I think we're going to probably see really different ways of, kids going back to school until we sort of have a handle on this thing. So that's one I think is going to be really different. Second thing I think that's going to start to really shift is, and you were talking about norms earlier, right? If you have a 16-year-old right now, what would you be thinking about in terms of college? Are you thinking, I'm going to write a $70,000 check to, Villanova University? Or am I instead going to take a gap year or invest in learning some other way? And I think we will see an absolute wave of closures of some of these smaller liberal arts schools that don't have a big brand, that really rely on a local setting that can't easily switch to offline. And I think that's going to be a big shift that we definitely will see.
Great. Another question comes from Questio. Would you share your thoughts on how you would overcome the challenges facing leadership as they create a culture of innovation?
I don't think it's actually that different now than it has ever been. I mean, my first litmus test for leadership who, talks about innovation is my agenda test. And so, I'll often get called, oh, Rita, we're really having trouble getting our innovations out the door. And so I'll say, look, send me the last meeting agendas. For the last few times, important people in your company got together to talk about important stuff. And they send me the agenda, and I'll take a highlighter pen and I'll go down the list, right? And if it's like item number 18 right next to material safety data sheet update, it's like you're not paying attention. So if innovation's important, it's going to be item 1, 2, or 3 on every meeting, every conversation, if your CEO types are not spending 30 to 40% of their time on innovation, it's not going to happen, because the rest of the organization's not stupid. They see what's prioritized by how you spend your time. So a great example of this is the CEO of the SAS Institute. Oh God, what's his name? Anyway, every Tuesday, he blocks off a chunk of time every Tuesday, big chunk of his time in the afternoon, and brings in all the people that are working on important new projects. And they go around the table, they do a demo, they get an update, and everybody knows that. So, you have a week, you have nothing to say. What are you, a pot plant, And SAS Institute for 40 years or so has been at the forefront of what we today would recognize as big data. But, it's a relentless push towards innovation. It's also been regarded as one of the best places to work. It's got a great corporate culture. And so that to me is a really great model of a leader who takes innovation seriously. It's not just lip service.
Great. We still might have a couple more questions to ask. So I'm going to ask this one from Robin, but if anyone else has any questions, please submit them now. So Robin asks, you mentioned that companies should consider a risk-fenced budget when applying discovery-driven planning to digital transformation. Do you have particular examples or suggestions to share that demonstrate this?
Sure. So one of the companies I'm working with, I think just passed $1 billion valuation. It's a startup called Varo Money. And Varo Money's niche is financially secure, but cash flow insecure millennials, basically. So these are people with jobs, young people, but they haven't built up much wealth yet. And so it's one car repair or wedding or, unexpected expense, and now they've got a cash flow problem. And so Varo really wants to serve them well. The whole bank is branchless. So you get intermediated by a phone app, right? So, and the app is actually, behind the app is a chatbot. And the chatbot can help you with most of your necessary activities. Well, you know, a big question came up in the design team about, well, what kind of personality should this chatbot have? And the group was sort of in two camps, right? One camp was, it should be like, hey, dude, tough weekend, don't worry, got your back, emoji, you know, hey, dude. And the other camp was, no, you know, it should be Mr. Robertson, you know, our advanced artificial intelligence has spotted the following disturbing patterns. Here's our recommendation for you. So, hey, dude versus Mr. Robertson. And a huge, you know, debate. Now, in many companies, how does that get resolved? Well, the most important person in the room makes the decision, and everybody goes charging off in that direction. And either they're right or they're wrong, right? Well, instead, with today's technologies, how would you answer that question? Well, obviously, you do an A/B test. So, you know, for $500, you can get two interns, put them in a closet. One plays Hey Dude, the other plays Mr. Robertson. You lure members of your target market in with free pizza, and you have them play with it, right? $500. Now, it turned out that they hated the Hey Dude guy. They absolutely hated it. If it's my money, if it's my future, if it's my security, you know, I want to be treated like a grown-up. So the Hey Dude people were wrong. But that's not really the right question. The question is, was it worth the $500 to this startup to learn what they needed to learn? So when I talk about ring fencing the risk, we know exactly what our risk is. It's $500, and you spend that $500 to get to an answer. Now, let's say we spent another $1,000 and we get to an answer that says chatbots actually don't work at all. Well, now we've got to redirect. And so that's what I mean. It's taking each step of the way and spelling out what your risk is and being really clear on what you're risking and what you're learning. And then you can take the next step with more confidence. And it gets rid of all these stupid conversations about, well, you were wrong, you failed. I mean, I don't know right now. You don't know. None of our listeners know. And so being right or wrong is kind of an irrelevant question right now. You've got to be, you know, prepared to learn.
Right. Well, Sally just mentioned something about millennials, and since it came up, you know, young people, as we've all been reading, are going to be very negatively affected by this crisis. As someone like you who looks into the future, how should they? Any advice for parents of and millennials or young people to see how they should plan forward, considering what we're facing and about to face?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. I think the best journey, right, is to develop your learning capability. So anything you can do that helps you learn more quickly, develop new skills more quickly, that keeps your options open at this stage, I think is worthwhile. I would try to avoid narrowly pinning yourself to a particular kind of, you know, I'm going to be a coder, I'm going to be whatever, because, you know, the future may require completely different things. I had a really interesting conversation with someone who does a lot of business work with the nursing home business. And he said, you know, there's going to be an explosion of a need for service workers. And he said, if you don't have parents and family members able to go into a nursing home, you know, you can't have them calling the nurses up and taking up all their time answering family questions. So there's going to have to be this whole additional layer of people who intermediate between, you know, concerned family members and what's going on there. So I think, you know, my advice would be learn as much as you can, you know, develop the ability to learn new things as much as you can. And then things like critical thinking, you know, being able to communicate clearly, you know, those kinds of things are going to be skills that are valuable no matter what. So I think my advice would be avoid getting too pigeonholed, but also avoid getting too freaked out. I mean, past recessions have taught us you often do come out the other side, and there is often opportunity to be found there.
Well, that's certainly good advice, not to get freaked out, because a lot of people are, as you know, including, you know, myself at times, this is a scary time, but we have to sort of maintain calmness and know that we'll get to the other side. I think that's really important to keep telling ourselves that.
Yeah, and I think try to find sources of stability. You know, even amidst all the chaos, try to find, you know, some things won't change, right? There are things that are going to be true tomorrow, and they're true right now. And I think anchoring on some of those key things is also like really valuable.
Right. So I want to ask you, let me just check. There's another question. Well, before I get to this next question, Rita, what about China? I know you mentioned China earlier. And obviously it's in the news a lot these days, but there's been sort of talk over the years about China and innovation, and it trends up and down, and everyone's sort of petrified sometimes about they're going to become this innovation powerhouse and really become super strong.
Mm-hmm.
And that concern goes up and down over the years depending
Mm-hmm.
on the trends. And what's your take as far as how do you view China as an innovator?
Well, one of the things I think the Chinese government has really done well is they've pushed a lot of control for local autonomy in a very distributed way. So yes, they're kind of a totalitarian state, but in that construct, you've got the managers of each, the leaders of each region or each county, I guess you'd call them, have a lot of autonomy, even within that structure. So I think the one thing they've done is instead of trying to be monolithic the way, say, Russia was, where they had the central power dictating supply and demand and who's going to do what, they had a very distributed approach. Second thing is that they have developed the skill of scaling. And if you want to make a computer in America today, you can't do it. And I think this is one of our public policy failings that, we've talked ourselves into this crazy idea that, we're going to come up with the innovative, higher value added parts of the value chain. We're going to let the low value added parts, like making masks, be farmed out to offshore people. Now, one of the things we know about innovation is that innovation often happens at that intersection between the provider and the user. And that innovation often happens because you can see the whole scaled chain of production. So what we've done over the last 30 years is we've allowed our homegrown, in America, stock of engineers and circuit board designers and that kind of middle layer of the high-tech function. We just don't have those people because we took our entire supply chains and let them scale elsewhere. So part of the thing that China's got that we don't is massive numbers of people who can do that kind of intermediate work. And I don't see that coming back anytime soon. I do think that with the crisis, people are going to have to be more thoughtful about where we do things. Farming off low value added face masks to Vietnam and China and other places like that sounded like a really efficient idea until those countries kind of decided, no, we're going to hang on to those. Thank you very much. And I think we're going to be rethinking a lot of those assumptions. So I would not count China out in any way. Now, their system is not without flaws, but they've done a really good job of being able to build up native capability that I think, America has not preserved.
Great. Well, this is probably going to be our last question, Rita. This is from Latte. Are the innovation tools related to the pandemic era different from the tools that you lean on in normal times?
Yeah. So if you think about, so let's take a specific example. If you think about something like net present value, right? It's in all the business school textbooks. Everybody knows it. You want to do a new project, you have to calculate net present value. And you can do that when uncertainty is low. So back to my business school example, right? I can give you the net present value up until now of a Columbia graduating class of business school people. However, as uncertainty increases, you increasingly can't do that. Right? Give me a net present value for the, investment in your local restaurant. You can't do it, you don't know. So what you have to be thinking about in that context, a highly uncertain context, is option value. Meaning, can I make a small decision today that buys me the right, but not the commitment to make a decision in the future when more is known? And so that simple distinction. If you're running an operation that's very predictable, you can use net present value. You can use return on invested capital or whatever metrics you want. As uncertainty increases, those tools become less useful. So where I think the tools of innovation start to have more purchase is because they're uncertainty friendly.
Great. Well, Rita, this has been really wonderful. Thank you for sharing all your insights.